This is completely unacceptable behavior. You are ruining everything.
Stop yelling, please, just stop.
My grandfather didn't raise his voice. He never did. He just looked across the table, past the honey-glazed ham, past the green chili cornbread, past the faces of everyone who claimed to love him, and said, "I won the lottery. $50 million. The room froze. I remember the exact sound of silence. The way the ceiling fan hummed overhead. The distant bark of a neighbor's dog somewhere in Gilbert. Through the window, the Superstition Mountains glowed burnt orange in the fading December sun. The kind of light that makes everything in Arizona look like it's on fire. Inside, the air turned cold. My mother's fork hit her plate with a small clink. My uncle's hand stopped mid-reach for the mashed potatoes. My cousin Brett just stared, mouth open. And me? I sat in my usual spot, the corner chair, the one closest to the kitchen and farthest from the conversation. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Because in that moment, something inside me already knew. What came next would change everything. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who I was in that family. Or rather, who I wasn't. Growing up in Mesa, I learned early that in our family, there were two kinds of people. Those who shined, and those who watched. I was born into the second category. My mother, Debra, was the youngest of two. And from the day she was born, she lived in the shadow of her older brother, Clayton. Clayton was everything a son was supposed to be. Tall, confident, good with money. He played football at Arizona State. Started his own real estate company before he was 30. Drove a black Mercedes and wore watches that cost more than my truck. My mother? She got pregnant at 19. Dropped out of community college. Married a man who left before I turned 2. And I became the living reminder of her mistakes. At family gatherings, Clayton's son Brett was the one everyone asked about. "How's lacrosse going? Did you get into ASU? Your dad says you're looking at law school." Me? I got a nod. Maybe a "Hey, Wyatt," if someone remembered my name. "He's shy," they'd say. "He doesn't talk much." But the truth is, no one ever asked what I had to say. I learned to make myself small, to not ask for seconds at dinner, to not expect birthday cards, to sit in the corner and be grateful I was invited at all. That was my role, the quiet one, the invisible one, the one who didn't matter. My grandfather's house in Gilbert was beautiful from the outside. Single-story ranch style with a terracotta roof. Desert landscaping out front. Saguaros standing tall like silent guards. Palo Verde trees with their green bark. A gravel yard that crunched under your boots. An American flag hung on the porch, faded to pale pink by decades of Arizona sun. From the street, it looked like the American dream. But inside those adobe walls, the rules were different. Clayton got the praise. Always. When he closed a big deal in Scottsdale, there was champagne. When he bought his McMansion in Paradise Valley, Grandpa drove out to see it 3 times in a week. But when my mother got divorced, silence. When she needed help with rent. You need to learn to stand on your own, Debra. I remember one Thanksgiving when I was 10. We drove up from our apartment in South Phoenix. The one with the water stains on the ceiling and the AC that only worked half the time. My mom had saved for weeks to buy a nice dress. She wanted to look presentable. We walked in, and the first thing my grandmother said was, "Debra, is that dress new? Must be nice to have money for shopping." My mother didn't respond. She just smiled and went to help in the kitchen. That night, I found her crying in the bathroom. I was too young to understand. But I remember thinking, something about this family is broken. And then there was Christmas when I was 12. Brett got a brand new mountain bike. Red and silver. Perfect for the trails up in Flagstaff. I got a sweater. Used. The tag cut out. But I could still see the faded B written inside the collar in Sharpie. Brett's old sweater. "It's practically new," my grandmother said, handing it to me. "No sense letting it go to waste." I smiled and said thank you, because that's what I had learned to do. But that night, lying in the guest room, the one with the creaky bed and the window that looked out at the empty desert, I cried. Not because of the sweater, but because I finally understood something that would take me another decade to fully accept. I would never be a priority in this family. And maybe I never was supposed to be. As I got older, the pattern only deepened. High school was a blur of working part-time jobs and keeping my head down. I bussed tables at a Mexican restaurant on Main Street in Mesa. I stocked shelves at the Fry's on Baseline. I saved every dollar I could. My mother worked double shifts at a call center in Tempe. Most nights, I made my own dinner, usually something from a can or a frozen burrito from Circle K. We didn't talk about the family much. But I saw her face every time we drove past Clayton's neighborhood. The way her jaw tightened. The way she gripped the steering wheel a little harder. She never said she resented him. But she didn't have to. When I graduated high school, there was no party. No celebration. Just a card from Grandpa with a $50 check and a note that said, "Congrats. Make something of yourself." Brett graduated the same year. He got a car. A used BMW, but still a BMW. I got a bus pass. And you know what? I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need them. I told myself that someday, I would prove them all wrong. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the Arizona heat pressed against the windows like a living thing, I wondered if they were right. Maybe I was nothing. Maybe I deserved to be invisible. Maybe this was just who I was meant to be. As I got older, the pattern only deepened. High school was a blur of working part-time jobs and keeping my head down. I bussed tables at a Mexican restaurant on Main Street in Mesa. I stocked shelves at the Fry's on Baseline. I saved every dollar I could. My mother worked double shifts at a call center in Tempe. Most nights, I made my own dinner, usually something from a can or a frozen burrito from Circle K. We didn't talk about the family much. But I saw her face every time we drove past Clayton's neighborhood. The way her jaw tightened. The way she gripped the steering wheel a little harder. She never said she resented him. But she didn't have to. When I graduated high school, there was no party. No celebration. Just a card from Grandpa with a $50 check and a note that said, "Congrats. Make something of yourself." Brett graduated the same year. He got a car. A used BMW, but still a BMW. I got a bus pass. And you know what? I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need them. I told myself that someday, I would prove them all wrong. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the Arizona heat pressed against the windows like a living thing, I wondered if they were right. Maybe I was nothing. Maybe I deserved to be invisible. Maybe this was just who I was meant to be. 2 years ago, I got a phone call that pulled me back. It was my mother. Her voice was strange, thin, almost scared. "It's your grandfather," she said. "He collapsed. They're saying it's his heart." I drove down that same night, for hours through the dark, down the winding mountain roads, back into the heat of the valley. Grandpa was at Banner Health in Phoenix, hooked up to machines, smaller than I remembered. The doctors said his heart was failing. Slowly but steadily. He needed someone to help him at home. Someone to take him to appointments. Someone to be there. Clayton couldn't do it. "I've got properties to manage," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "The market in Scottsdale is crazy right now. I can't just drop everything." My mother couldn't do it either. "I'm 2 hours away in Tucson, Wyatt. You know I would if I could." Would she, though? So I did it. I quit my job in Flagstaff, gave up my apartment, moved back to the valley and into my grandfather's guest room. For the next 2 years, I became his caretaker. I drove him to Mayo Clinic 3 times a week. I learned his medication schedule by heart. I cooked him green chili stew the way Grandma used to make it, the recipe handwritten on a stained index card I found in the kitchen drawer. Some nights, when he couldn't sleep, we'd sit on the back patio and watch the city lights spread across the valley below. He talked about Grandma, about the early days when they had nothing, about building a life in Arizona when it was still wild and open. And sometimes he talked about his children, about the disappointments he never said out loud, about the things he saw that no one thought he noticed. During those 2 years, Clayton visited maybe a dozen times. Never for long. Always with an excuse waiting. "Just checking in, Dad. got a showing in an hour. But it was never really about checking in. It was about the money. Dad, have you thought about updating your estate plan? Things change, you know. The laws are different now. Dad, that property in Sedona, it's worth a fortune now. We should talk about transferring the title. Tax purposes. Dad, I talked to a financial advisor. He says we should consolidate your accounts. Make it simpler for when, for when you die. He never said it, but we all heard it. My mother was the same, just with a different approach. Guilt instead of strategy. You know how hard things have been for me, Dad. After the divorce. After everything. A little help would go a long way. I heard these conversations from the hallway, from the kitchen, from my room, and every time Grandpa's face was the same. Patient, calm, watching. I thought he was just tolerating them, that he didn't really notice. I was wrong. He was keeping track. Every word, every ask, every lie. 3 months before that Christmas, Grandpa called me into his study. It was late afternoon. The sun was setting over the McDowell Mountains, turning the sky into layers of orange and purple. His study was a small room at the back of the house. Walls lined with books he'd collected over 60 years. A mesquite wood desk that had belonged to his father. The smell of old paper and leather. "Close the door," he said. I did. On the desk there were papers, legal documents, a lottery ticket from the Arizona lottery. "You know what this is?" he asked, holding up the ticket. I shook my head. $50 million, he said. I bought this ticket 6 months ago at the Circle K on Baseline Road. Same place I've been buying them for 30 years. Your grandmother used to tell me I was throwing money away. He smiled at the memory. Guess I proved her wrong. I couldn't speak. My brain was still processing the number. I haven't told anyone, he continued. Not Clayton. Not Debra. Not a soul. Why? I finally managed. Because I wanted to see what they would do when they thought I had nothing left to give. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder. Thick, heavy. This is everything, Wyatt. Everything they've done. Everything they thought I didn't see. He opened the folder. Emails from Clayton. Dozens of them. Asking for loans. Complaining about business setbacks. Blaming everyone but himself. Messages from my mother. Passive-aggressive guilt trips. Comparisons to Clayton. Hints about inheritance. And then the documents that made my blood run cold. A power of attorney. Filed with the county. Giving Clayton access to Grandpa's bank accounts at Wells Fargo. With a signature that wasn't Grandpa's. He forged it, I whispered. Last spring, Grandpa nodded. When I was in the hospital for a week. He thought I wouldn't notice. But the bank called to confirm. And I asked them to send me a copy. He tapped the signature with his finger. That's not my handwriting. And we both know it. I stared at the document. At the notary stamp. At the trail of lies. They think I'm senile, Grandpa said. They think I'm too old to notice. But I see everything, Wyatt. I always have. He looked at me with eyes that were sharp, clear, and tired. And I see you too. The only one who never asked for anything. The only one who showed up. That night I called Kaylee. She'd moved to Tucson for work, but we talked almost every day. She was the only person outside that house who knew my story. The only one who understood. I told her everything. The lottery. The documents. The forged signature. The plan my grandfather was forming. For a long moment, she was quiet. Then she said, Wyatt, you're not imagining this. It's real. And your grandfather chose you for a reason. But what if they're right? I said. What if I'm just not the kind of person who deserves this? They've spent your whole life making you feel that way, she said. That doesn't make it true. I didn't respond. Listen to me, she continued. You dropped everything to take care of him. You gave up your job, your apartment, your whole life in Flagstaff. And you never asked for a thing. That's just what you do for family. No, she said firmly. That's what you do. That's who you are. And it's time you started believing it. For the first time in months, I took a deep breath. Someone believed in me. Maybe it was time I started believing in myself. Over the next few weeks, Grandpa and I talked. Not about money, not about inheritance, but about life, about what mattered. He told me about Grandma, about how they met at a dance in Tucson in 1962, about how she volunteered at St. Vincent Delaware Paul for 30 years, feeding the homeless in downtown Phoenix. She always said the measure of a person isn't what they have. He told me one evening. It's what they give. He had a plan, and he wanted me to be there when it happened. At Christmas, he said, when everyone's together, that's when the truth comes out. Are you sure? I asked. It's going to be a lot. I'm 65 years old, Wyatt. I've watched my children lie, manipulate, and scheme. I've watched them treat you like you don't exist. I've stayed quiet long enough. He looked out the window at the desert stretching toward the mountains. Your grandmother would have wanted this. She always saw the truth about people. She saw it in you, too, when you were just a little boy. She used to say you were the only one with a good heart. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. I wasn't angry anymore. Not really. What I felt was clarity. The kind that comes after years of confusion. The kind that finally lets you draw a line. Christmas Day arrived. The house was decorated the way it had been every year since I could remember. Lights strung along the roofline, a wreath on the door, a small nativity scene on the front porch, the plaster figures faded by decades of desert sun. Inside, the tree glowed in the corner, presents underneath, the smell of roasting ham and green chili tamales filling the air. Clayton arrived first, in his Mercedes. He wore a cashmere sweater and a gold watch that caught the light. His wife, Madison, was all smiles and air kisses. Brett came with them, taller now, with the same entitled posture as his father. My mother arrived an hour later. She'd driven up from Tucson with her latest boyfriend, a guy named Steve who sold insurance and laughed too loud at his own jokes. No one asked about my life. No one asked about Flagstaff or my classes or Kaylee. Clayton did ask one question, though. Still working at that auto shop? He said it with a smirk, like it was a joke. I take care of Grandpa now, I said. Right. He nodded, already losing interest. Good for you. I went back to my corner, and I waited. Dinner started like it always did. Clayton talking about his latest development project near Camelback Mountain. Madison agreeing with everything he said. My mother complaining about the drive from Tucson and how the I-10 was a nightmare. Steve laughed at something that wasn't funny. And me? I sat in my usual spot, the corner, the place where no one looked, until Grandpa tapped his fork gently against his glass. The sound was soft, but it cut through the noise like a blade. The room went quiet. I have an announcement, he said. Clayton straightened in his chair. My mother's eyes went wide. They both leaned forward, practically salivating. This was it, the moment they'd been waiting for. I won the lottery, Grandpa said calmly. $50 million. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Clayton exploded with excitement. Dad, that's incredible. We need to talk about this. Asset protection. Trusts. I know people, financial advisors, estate planners. We can set up a meeting this week. I can. I'm not finished, Grandpa said. Clayton's mouth closed. His smile stayed, but it was frozen now. Uncertain. I've already decided what to do with the money, Grandpa continued. Well, sure. But we should really discuss the tax implications. $25 million, Grandpa said, ignoring him, is going to St. Vincent Delaware Paul, the same charity where your mother volunteered for 30 years. She spent every Saturday morning at that shelter, feeding people who had nothing. And she would have wanted this. My mother blinked. Dad, that's a lot of money to just give away. It's my money, Debra. She closed her mouth. The other $25 million, Grandpa continued, and now he turned to look directly at me, goes to my grandson, Wyatt. The room didn't just go quiet. Collapsed. Clayton's face went from red to white in about half a second. He stood up so fast his chair scraped against the tile floor. That's absurd, he said. He's a kid. He works at an auto shop. He doesn't know the first thing about managing. He knows how to show up, Grandpa interrupted. He knows how to take care of someone without asking what's in it for him. He knows what loyalty means. This is insane. You're not thinking clearly. Your memory. My memory is fine, Clayton. Grandpa reached beneath the table and pulled out a folder. The same folder he'd shown me 3 months ago. He placed it on the table. Opened it. This is a power of attorney you filed last spring. While I was in the hospital. He held up the document. That's not my signature. Clayton's face went completely pale. Dad, I can explain. You forged my name to get access to my accounts. Grandpa's voice was calm, almost gentle. Wells Fargo sent me the confirmation. I have the records. Madison looked at her husband with an expression I'd never seen before. Doubt, fear. And these, Grandpa continued, pulling out a stack of printed emails, are the messages you've sent me over the past 2 years. 47 requests for money. 16 complaints about how unfair life is. 0 visits that lasted more than 30 minutes. He turned to my mother. And Debra. 23 emails asking for help with rent, credit cards, or car payments. Every single visit. A new story about how hard things are. My mother's mouth opened, but no words came out. In 2 years, neither of you spent more than a few hours in this house. Neither of you asked how I was doing. Neither of you offered to help. He looked at me. Wyatt gave up everything to be here, and he never once asked for a thing. The silence was deafening. Clayton tried one more time. He manipulated you, he said, pointing at me. He's been whispering in your ear this whole time. He's always been a what, Clayton? Grandpa's voice was quiet, patient, waiting. Clayton didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Everyone knew what he was going to say. Grandpa turned to me. Wyatt, he said, do you want to say something? The whole room was looking at me. Clayton with contempt. My mother with something like shock or maybe shame. Brett, confused. Madison calculating. Steve wishing he was anywhere else. And me? For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I stood up slowly. My hands were steady. My voice was calm. I looked at my uncle, at my mother, at everyone who had spent 23 years treating me like I was furniture. And I said, you didn't ignore me because I was quiet. You ignored me because it was easier. But someone was paying attention. The room didn't move. No one breathed. And then, slowly, something shifted. The whole structure of our family, the hierarchy that had been built over decades, cracked right down the middle. I didn't wait for a response. There was nothing left to say. I turned to my grandfather and said, quietly, thank you. He nodded. Just once. A small gesture, but it held everything. I walked toward the door. Clayton grabbed my arm as I passed. Wyatt, wait. Let's talk about this. You don't have to. I stopped, looked at his hand on my arm, then at his face. I don't need your approval, I said. I never did. I pulled my arm free and kept walking. My mother called after me. Wyatt, you can't just leave. We're family. I paused at the door, hand on the handle. I didn't turn around. Yeah, I said. I know. And I walked out. The cool December air of the Sonoran Desert hit me like a wave. Above, the stars were just beginning to appear. The Milky Way would be out soon, stretching across the sky the way it had for millions of years before any of us existed. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. And for the first time in 23 years, I didn't look back. 3 months later, I was sitting on the porch of a small cabin near Greer, up in the White Mountains. Kaylee was beside me, wrapped in a wool blanket. We had mugs of hot coffee in our hands, steam rising into the cold morning air. Snow had fallen overnight. The ponderosa pines were dusted white. A creek ran somewhere nearby, the sound of water over stones mixing with the silence. It was a different world up here, 8,000 feet above the desert, above the heat, above everything I used to be. Grandpa had transferred part of the money into an account in my name. I hadn't touched most of it. I wasn't sure what to do with it yet. But I knew what I didn't want. I didn't want to become like them. Clayton had tried to contest the will, hired lawyers, filed motions, lost every single one. The forged power of attorney was enough to discredit everything he said. My mother stopped calling after the second week. I didn't know if she was angry or ashamed. Maybe both. Honestly, it was okay. Some people are only in your life because of blood. And blood isn't always enough. I looked down at my hands. They still had calluses from years at the auto shop. Faint traces of grease in the creases that would never quite wash out. Clayton used to look at those hands with disgust, like they were proof of something shameful. But now, when I looked at them, I saw something different. I saw work. I saw honesty. I saw a life I'd built with nothing but what I had. And I saw proof that I was never what they said I was. The silence around me was different now. Not empty, not lonely, not the silence of being ignored. It was mine. Kaylee leaned against my shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. I looked out at the mountains, at the snow, at the sky turning gold as the sun rose over the pines. "I'm thinking," I said, "that I finally feel like myself." She smiled. "It's about time. If the story touched something in you, tell me where you're watching from. If you've lived something similar, if you've been the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one who was never a priority, your story deserves to be heard. Maybe you're still waiting for someone to see you. Maybe you've already found your way out. Maybe you're somewhere in between. Wherever you are, you're not alone. Drop a comment below. Share your story. Or just let me know you're out there. Subscribe for the next chapter, because there are more truths to uncover. And I'll be here when you're ready.